Um, Yesterday morning, you probably woke up, scrolled through your phone and saw a headline declaring that drinking 3 cups of coffee a day prevents Alzheimer's.
Oh, yeah, we all see those.
Right. And you probably felt a little rush of validation, poured yourself a second mug, and just went about your day.
Yeah, exactly.
But imagine if today that same feed serves up a totally different headline from a different outlet saying, new research links daily coffee habits to severe joint inflammation.
Right, the exact opposite conclusion.
Exactly. And if you're like most of us, your brain immediately went to work dismissing that second headline.
Oh, sure.
Maybe you told yourself sample size was too small or the outlet is clickbait. Basically, you protected the first headline and discarded the second.
Because it feels better.
Right. But how did your brain actually make that choice? Did you really evaluate the methodologies of both studies before you took a sip of that latte?
Definitely not.
All right. I mean, or did your mental operating system just automatically process the information that made you feel good and reject the information that demanded a change in your behavior?
It's a slightly terrifying question when you really sit with it.
It really is.
Because we are making thousands of those micro-judgments every single week.
Yeah.
And the reality is we aren't actually evaluating the evidence. We are running modern high-velocity data streams through evolutionary hardware that was designed to track whether a rustle in the bushes was a tiger or the wind.
Wow, yeah.
It was not designed to parse conflicting epidemiological studies on an algorithmic timeline.
And that biological mismatch is exactly why we are pulling apart today's source material. We're doing a deep dive into a really fascinating document called Clear, a Lean Field Manual for Critical Thinking Operator Edition 1.1.
It's a great text.
It is. And the mission of this deep dive is to basically offer you a software patch for that evolutionary hardware. But before we get into the actual tools, I have to bring up the background of this manual because it sets the stakes so perfectly.
Yeah, the background is key here.
The introduction states that this framework was originally developed from, and I'm quoting here, a constitutional architecture for distributed cognition.
Right.
Now that sounds incredibly sci-fi. It sounds like something out of a cyberpunk novel. What does that actually mean in plain English?
It does sound like jargon, but the concept is actually highly practical. Distributed cognition just means how groups of people, whether that's a massive tech company, a hospital network, or just a society as a whole, how they think and process information together.
Okay.
Because no single human brain holds the entire blueprint for building a commercial jet, right?
Nobody knows how to build a whole plane from scratch.
Exactly. The knowledge is distributed across thousands of engineers. So a constitutional architecture for that is just a set of governing rules to make sure all those separate brains are processing reality using the exact same standard of evidence.
Oh, I see.
If the aerodynamics team has a different definition of the word proven than the materials team, the plane is going to crash.
Okay, let's unpack this because the manual says right up front that most reasoning failures, whether it's a plane crashing or an individual believing a wild internet rumor, they aren't failures of raw intelligence.
No, they aren't.
Which, frankly, is a huge relief to read.
It really is.
But if highly educated, brilliant people are constantly believing and acting on completely unsupported things and is not a lack of IQ, what is the mechanical failure happening in their heads?
Well, the manual introduces a core governing idea that totally reorients how we look at human error. It proposes that you must give every claim exactly as much authority as it has earned.
Okay.
And no more. And the reason smart people fail at this is due to a very specific mechanism called unsupported promotion.
The silent promotion. I mean, this concept completely changed how I look at my own thoughts.
It is the central defect of human reasoning. We have this tendency to let information silently gain authority and certainty as we hand it off from one thought to the next.
Oh, man.
Let's look at how this happens in the physical world. Imagine you are a factory manager. You walk the floor and you look at a digital readout on a machine. You note the temperature gauge reads 104 degrees.
Okay.
That is step one. It's just an observation. It's a reported state. But human brains hate static facts. We want narrative. So almost instantly, that observation is silently promoted into an inference. The inference is the internal bearing is failing.
Because 104 degrees is unusually hot, so the brain automatically fills in the blank with friction, heat, failing part.
Precisely, you've made a jump. But the internal bearing failing is not an observation. It is a guess based on the heat.
Right.
But we don't stop there. That inference is rapidly promoted into a prediction. The prediction is this machine is going to seize up completely in the next 48 hours.
So the stakes are compounding now.
Exactly. The prediction then becomes a recommendation. We need to reduce the load on this line and get an inspection crew down here.
Wow.
And finally, that recommendation is promoted into a decision or action. Shut down the entire assembly line at 6 p.m. tonight.
So we went from the gauge says 104 to halt millions of dollars in production.
Exactly. At each step of that chain, from observation to inference to prediction to recommendation to action, crucial context is being stripped away and lost. But the authority and urgency of the claim are magically increasing.
Yeah, it's crazy.
By the time it reaches the decision stage, the fact that this whole cascade was built on a single unverified temperature reading is completely forgotten.
Reading this, I just kept picturing the old childhood game of telephone where you whisper a phrase in a circle and it mutates.
Right.
But in this case, it's like a game of telephone where every time the whisper is passed to the next person, it gets treated as a more binding, notarized legal contract.
Yes.
Or to use an analogy from the text, it's like a corporate ladder where an entry-level intern, that's our basic observation about the temperature, is suddenly signing million-dollar checks in the boardroom without anyone checking their promotion paperwork.
That is the perfect way to visualize it. And to stop that intern from bankrupting the company, the CLEAR manual introduces the rule of gated promotion, sometimes called non-promotion.
Okay.
It dictates that a claim only gains a stronger status when the transition to the next step has its own specific verifiable warrant.
Got it.
You cannot promote the observation of heat into an inference of a failing bearing unless you have established a bridge. Maybe checking vibration sensors or historical maintenance logs. A does not imply B simply because B sounds like a logical story.
But look, I'm reading this and I find myself resisting it a bit.
Oh yeah, it's tough.
Because if we to check the paperwork for every single thought cascade we have, aren't we just going to be hopelessly paralyzed? I mean, if I have to pause and demand a verifiable warrant for every inference I make about my inbox, my family, or the news, I'm never going to leave my house.
Right.
It feels like an impossible standard for daily life.
This raises an important question, and it's the exact friction the architects of the CLEAR manual anticipated. They explicitly acknowledge that permanent skepticism is a failure road. Oh, okay.
If you demand perfect evidence for everything, you become utterly incapable of navigating the world. So they introduce a triage mechanism. They call it Mental Constitution Rule 1, which is attention follows risk.
So we don't apply the heavy scrutiny to everything, we match the effort to the danger.
Exactly. The framework is strictly risk adaptive. They break it down into 3 operational gears. First is scan. This is your baseline. It's a 30 to 60 second mental check.
Okay.
You use this for routine claims, scrolling social media, answering low-stakes emails, or glancing at AI summaries. You are just doing a quick vibe check for obvious red flags.
So you're just glancing at the intern's badge as they walk through the lobby.
Right. You don't interrogate them. But if a claim has the potential to change an important belief or lead to a moderate decision with actual consequences, say a change in your personal investment strategy or a new project direction at work, you shift up into assess.
All right, so we're slowing down.
This is a 5 to 20 minute analytical process. This is where you actually run the core clear loop, which we will break down in a moment. Okay, so scan for the daily noise. Assess for moderate choices. What's the highest gear?
Investigate. You only deploy this for high-stakes, irreversible, highly uncertain, or adversarial problems. Buying a house, launching a startup, making a severe medical choice.
The big stuff.
Exactly. This is where you bring out the massive cognitive machinery. You build competing hypotheses. You rigorously preserve your source chains. You define explicit review triggers, and you actively seek out independent challengers to tear your logic apart.
Wow.
Triage is built into the core of the system because investigating a viral tweet with the rigor of a home purchase is a total misuse of your cognitive capital.
That structural permission to just let the low-stakes things go is incredibly freeing.
It is.
It means when we do need to focus, we actually have the energy for it. So let's assume we are facing a moderate to high-stakes problem. We need to deploy the actual machinery. Let's dive into the 5-step clear workflow itself. The acronym stands for Clarify, Locate, Evaluate, Attack, and Resolve.
Right.
And the very first quality control gate is C, which is clarify.
Yes. Because, as the manual points out, A poorly framed problem will make completely irrelevant evidence look highly decisive. And the most dangerous trap at this stage is our reliance on slogans and compressed narratives.
We see this constantly.
Mm.
People argue endlessly over phrases like, the market is manipulated, or the media lied, or the AI model's biased.
Right. Those phrases are incredibly powerful for rallying a crowd, and they might even point toward real phenomena, but from an analytical standpoint, they are useless.
Right.
You cannot test a slogan. You have to force that compressed narrative to expand into an actual measurable proposition. You need to know who specifically did what through which exact mechanism in which domain, producing what tangible outcome.
I was reading this section on clarifying, and my mind went straight back to that hypothetical coffee headline we talked about at the start.
Oh yeah, the Alzheimer's one.
Yeah, well, a generic one, like a new study, proves that people who drink coffee live longer. On the surface, that looks like a single analyzable fact. But if we run it through the clarify step, we realize it's completely loaded with silent promotions.
It's essentially a Russian nesting doll of unsupported leaps. Let's strip the rhetoric. First, the word study. That word hides the entire structural design. Was it a randomized controlled trial? Was it observational? Did they study 10 college students over a weekend or 100,000 nurses over 20 years?
Right. And then you hit the word proves. That is a massive promotion. It implies a direct causal warrant. It tells the reader that the coffee itself mechanically caused the longevity, rather than just pointing out that coffee drinkers happen to share some other lifestyle trait that keeps them alive.
Exactly. And the most manipulative part is the phrase live longer. It implies a future intervention. It suggests that if you, the reader, go buy a coffee machine today, you will alter your biological lifespan.
When in reality,
the data probably just found a historical association in a very specific, already dead population.
And here's where I want to pull in one of the specific optical illusions the manual warns about later on, because it fits so perfectly with this coffee study. The manual talks about the quantitative denominator audit.
Yes, such an important concept.
Because sometimes the claim is clarified, but the math itself is a mirage.
This is a brilliant connection to make. Because numbers inherently feel precise to us. The moment a decimal point or a percentage appears in a headline, our critical faculties tend to just shut off. We assume rigor. But the manual warns us about the illusion of relative versus absolute risk.
Right. So let's say our clarified coffee study says drinking coffee decreases your risk of a specific heart disease by a massive 50%.
Okay.
That sounds like a miracle drug.
It sounds like something you should immediately alter your life to achieve.
Yeah.
But then you run the denominator audit. You ask, what was the baseline risk of getting this disease in the first place? And you discover the baseline risk for the average person was 2%.
And a 50% reduction of 2% means your risk drops to 1%.
Exactly. So going from a 2% chance to a 1% chance is a 1 percentage point absolute decrease. But because 1 is half of 2, it is also a 50% relative decrease.
Oh, man.
The headline writer chose the relative number because it sounds explosive. Both statements are mathematically true. But one creates a global health fad, and the other might not even warrant changing your breakfast order. If you don't know the denominator, a percentage isn't data, it's a weaponized number.
Okay, so we've clarified the claim, we stripped the slogans, we checked our denominators, and we finally have a clunky but testable proposition. But getting the specific claim right doesn't matter if the underlying data is just an echo chamber.
Which brings us to the second step.
Right, L-locate. This is where we move upstream.
Yes. The goal here is to find the earliest accessible source of the claim. And the manual makes a distinction here that is absolutely vital for surviving the digital age. The difference between source count and objective independence.
I feel like this trips up almost everyone, myself included. We look at our news feeds and we think, well, 12 different prestigious outlets are all reporting this event. It must be an absolute lockdown fact.
But the locate step forces you to map the dependency. If all 12 of those news outlets are just citing the exact same original AP Wire report, you do not have 12 pieces of corroborating evidence.
No.
You have one primary path and 11 echoes. You have high source count, but zero effective independence.
I immediately apply this to how we use modern technology. So if I ask an AI a complex question, and it generates an answer, and then I open 4 other AI tools and ask them the same question, and they all give me the exact same conclusion.
You think you have consensus.
Exactly. I think I've just pulled a consensus of 5 brilliant, distinct experts. But If they were uptrained on the same foundational data scraping, or they're using the same underlying model API wrapped in different interfaces, they're heavily dependent evidence.
Yeah.
It's just the same model wearing 5 different hats agreeing with itself.
That is exactly how the illusion of plurality operates today. It provides false confidence through sheer volume. To truly locate, you must run a mental ablation test. If I removed the common upstream source, that one data set, that single-wire report, that foundational AI training set, how many independent original information paths would actually remain?
Wow.
Often the answer is 0.
So we've clarified the claim, we've located the true independent upstream source. Now we hit step 3E, evaluate. And this is all about what the manual calls the evidence ladder.
The paradigm shift in this step is moving away from the idea that evidence is universally strong or weak in a vacuum. Evidence is only strong or weak relative to a specific purpose.
That took me a second to wrap my head around.
Uh-huh.
How can the same piece of evidence be both strong and weak?
Think about a rough back-of-the-napkin calculation regarding a sudden drop in website traffic at a company. For the purpose of triage deciding if this issue is severe enough to warrant calling a 1-hour emergency meeting, that back-of-the-napkin math is very strong evidence. It's perfectly sufficient. But for the purpose of firing the head of marketing for incompetence, that exact same piece of evidence is incredibly weak.
Right. You are borrowing authority if you use the triage evidence to execute the firing.
Huh.
We can't just slap a folder on the table and say we have evidence without asking evidence of what exactly and for what consequence.
And to keep us honest here, the manual demands we use a disciplined uncertainty vocabulary. It tries to break our cultural habit of collapsing everything into a binary of just true or false.
Instead, it offers this spectrum: known, likely, plausible, possible, unknown, contradicted. And looking at that list, I realized something. We have a terrible, almost reflexive habit of taking a claim that evaluates as possible, which just strictly means the laws of physics don't prevent it from happening, and we silently promote it to probable.
It's a massive vulnerability. We hear a wild story or a conspiracy theory, and our brain says, well, it's possible. I can't prove it didn't happen.
Right.
But mere possibility carries almost 0 probability weight. To bridge the gap from possible to probable, you have to look at base rates. You have to ask structurally, how often does an event like this actually occur in the real world?
Okay, we're moving down the loop. We've evaluated the strength of the evidence. Now we reach step 4A, attack.
Yes.
And I have to say this sounds incredibly aggressive, but the manual is very clear about the intent. The goal is not to become a debate bro who just wants to destroy every belief you encounter.
No, the goal is testing for challenge elasticity. A healthy, well-reasoned belief should bend and change when it encounters material, validated counter-evidence. But it should remain entirely stable if you just throw irrelevant emotional noise at it. You are stress testing the architecture of your own conclusion.
And the main tool they give us for this attack phase is the disconfirmation search. Usually when we have a theory, we do a confirmation search.
Yeah.
We ask what data supports my hypothesis.
And the internet will always oblige you.
Always. You can find a community that supports any theory. But the disconfirmation search flips the polarity. It asks if my hypothesis is completely wrong. What specific things would I expect to see in the world, and are those things present?
It forces you to look for the absence of evidence where evidence should loudly exist, or the presence of contrary indicators. It moves you from being a lawyer defending a client to a detective trying to break an alibi.
But the tool in this attack section that really got under my skin, here's where it gets really interesting. The manual introduces a technique called the identity swap. It operates like a metal detector for your own personal bias.
It really does.
But look, I get the identity swap in theory, but if we're being honest, when I tried to apply it to modern politics or social issues, it felt nearly impossible.
It is deeply uncomfortable because it forces you to confront your own neurochemistry. Explain how you tried to apply it.
So the rule says, you take a contentious situation, a scandal, a controversial policy, and you mentally swap out the identity of the political actor or the CEO or the institution involved, but you lock in the exact same evidence structure.
Okay.
And then you have to look yourself in the mirror and ask, honestly, would I demand the same level of proof? If I swapped in a politician I absolutely despise, would I interpret this exact same ambiguous email as an honest administrative mistake or as smoking gun proof of a malicious conspiracy?
And what did you find?
And my brain absolutely refused to give the people I don't like the benefit of the doubt. How does this manual expect us to actually bypass our own hardwiring?
It doesn't expect you to bypass it entirely. It expects you to observe it. The manual notes A very common misunderstanding here, doing an identity swap does not prove that two different politicians or cases are morally equivalent. That's not the point.
Right.
The point is to expose your own internal evidence processing machinery. It proves to you undeniably that your standard of proof is floating.
It's brutal because you realize, oh, wow, I was ready to publicly convict this person based on a blurry photo and a rumor. But when the exact same level of evidence targets a leader I admire, suddenly I'm demanding notarized confessions, 3 eyewitnesses, and a grand jury before I even form an opinion.
It forces you to acknowledge that your epistemic standards are being driven by tribal affiliation, not by the quality of the data. And acknowledging that is the only way to begin correcting it.
Which brings us to the final step of the loop, our resolve. Because as fascinating as it is to analyze our own biases, at the end of the day, we have to interact with reality. We have to do something.
And this step draws a massive heavy line between epistemic belief and action. We often confuse the two.
So let's unpack epistemic belief first, because that sounds like philosophy class.
Epistemic belief is simply your internal assessment of what is factually true about the world and your confidence level in that truth. Action is what physical or social steps you're going to take based on that assessment. The critical insight of the resolve step is that facts do not automatically author decisions. The gap between them is bridged by costs, values, and reversibility.
Give me a tangible example of how belief and action can split like that.
Think about asymmetric costs. Let's say you are cleaning out a dark garage and someone tells you they think they saw a highly venomous spider crawl into a specific cardboard box.
Oh boy.
Now, epistemically, your confidence that a deadly spider is in that exact box might be very low. It evaluates as merely possible or plausible. You didn't see it, the lighting is bad, and the person who warned you is notoriously jumpy.
So my belief that it's true is maybe at 15%.
Right. But your action threshold is met instantly. You don't need to reach 95% certainty to act because the cost of being wrong and ignoring it is severe a hospital visit or worse.
Exactly.
And the cost of action, putting on thick leather gloves or just taking the box outside before opening it, is incredibly low and completely reversible.
I don't need a PhD in entomology and a peer-reviewed study to decide to put on gloves.
Exactly. Conversely, you might have extremely high epistemic confidence, say 90%, that a junior employee at your firm made a careless mistake.
Okay.
But if the proposed action is to publicly fire them and permanently ruin their career reputation, that 90% certainty might not cross the action threshold. The cost is too catastrophic and irreversible. The resolve step forces you to define both variables, what do I believe is true, and separately, what action is actually warranted.
Okay, so we've built the complete clear loop, clarify, locate, evaluate, attack, resolve. We can strip slogans, trace sources, weigh evidence, attack our own biases, and separate truth from action.
It's a solid toolkit.
It is. But the manual doesn't just hand you the tool, it warns you about the psychological environment you're operating in.
Yeah.
We already covered the quantitative denominator illusion with our coffee example. But there's another major optical illusion the text highlights that I want to dig into. It's called the intent illusion, and it deals directly with our evolutionary love for storytelling.
Human beings are fundamentally narrative creatures. We want the world to make sense as a story. And a good story requires a villain. But the manual issues a stark, almost counterintuitive warning here. Benefit is not authorship.
Benefit is not authorship. We violate this rule every single day.
Constantly. We look at a complex outcome, say a shift in global trade policies or a massive fluctuation in a specific commodity market. We see that company X made $1 billion as a direct result of that chaos.
Right.
And our brains immediately seamlessly promote motive and incentive straight to causal action. We conclude, company X orchestrated the entire geopolitical event.
It's the ultimate unsupported promotion. We assume that because they won the game, they must have rigged the board. But why is that assumption so dangerous? Don't powerful entities manipulate things?
They absolutely do, but assuming intent by default blinds you to how complex systems actually operate. Large institutions, governments, and markets do not work like a single unified mind sitting in a volcano lair.
Right, it's not a James Bond villain.
No outcomes are almost always generated through incredibly messy bargaining, overlapping jurisdictions, bizarre institutional incentives, and sheer incompetence. By blaming a mastermind, you fail to understand the systemic vulnerabilities that actually cause the event.
The manual illustrates this perfectly with the institutional network map. You see these graphics on social media all the time. Someone will post this massive, terrifying chart showing organization A and organization B.
The red string on a corkboard croak.
Exactly. And there are all these red lines connecting them because they happen to share 3 board members, or they co-sponsored a charity gala in 2018. And the caption is always screaming, look, organization A completely controls organization B. It's a conspiracy.
And that is the exact trap. They are substituting network adjacency for causal control. The manual states very clearly structural opportunity is not proof of exercised command. Yes, sharing board members gives those entities the opportunity to coordinate. It creates a pathway for influence. But you cannot infer intent and dictate just by looking at a map of relationships. It requires actual behavioral evidence memos, communications, verifiable actions that Organization A dictated a policy to Organization B.
It's like saying that just because I have my neighbor's phone number, I somehow command everything that happens inside their house.
Exactly.
Opportunity does not equal control. If you don't have the behavioral proof, you aren't doing analysis, you're just writing fan fiction about billionaires.
That is a harsh but accurate way to frame it.
Which perfectly transitions us to the final major trap, and arguably the most dangerous one for the world we are stepping into right now, the AI trap. The manual calls it outsourcing judgment.
AI is uniquely dangerous to critical thinking because of a property called fluent synthesis. Human bullshit usually has visual cues. If a person is lying to you, they might stutter.
Right.
If a website is peddling conspiracy theories, it usually has terrible graphic design, all caps fonts, and bizarre formatting.
Right. Our brains use those low-fidelity signals to trigger our scan defense. We see the crazy font and we think, okay, ignore this.
But an AI strips all of that away. It can take a weak assumption, a disputed historical fact, and a solid data point, and blend them into a beautifully written, grammatically flawless, highly confident paragraph.
It's so smooth.
It completely erases the provenance of the information. You cannot see the seams where the facts were stitched to the hallucinations.
So if I sit down and just prompt an AI to give me the best answer to a complex, high-stakes question, I am basically begging it to collapse all 5 steps of the clear loop into one hidden opaque jump.
You are outsourcing your judgment completely.
So how do we use this technology without lobotomizing ourselves?
What's fascinating here is how practical the manual solution is. It absolutely does not tell you to abandon AI. Instead, it mandates that you use AI as a role-separated system. You never treat it as a single oracle that hands you the final, definitive truth.
So you break the AI into specific staff members.
Exactly. You prompt it for separated tasks. First, you might have it play the retriever, where its only job is to locate foundational documents and summarize their abstracts. Then you spin up a new prompt and have it play the extractor, pulling specific data tables out of a PDF without doing any interpretation.
But the most powerful tool I saw was how they suggest prompting the AI during the attack phase.
Yes. The manual gives a very specific, aggressive prompt to use on AI outputs. It suggests commanding the model with this list the core claims in your previous answer that depend heavily on a shared upstream source. Then, for your major conclusion, provide the strongest alternative explanation supported by the data.
I love that. You are forcing the machine to show its internal dependency map, and you are literally automating your disconfirmation search. You're making the AI steelman the opposing argument for you.
You are outsourcing the heavy lifting of data synthesis, but you are rigorously maintaining your role as the cognitive operator. You retain the judgment.
Okay, so we've navigated the specific traps. We've protected our judgment from AI. But as we transition into the final philosophical takeaway of this manual, we hit a wall. And authors are incredibly self-aware about this.
They are.
The biggest risk of internalizing all these critical thinking tools, the loops, the gated promotions, the denominator audits, is that it turns you into a neurotic, permanent skeptic, someone who is so utterly terrified of making an unsupported promotion that they just freeze and never make a decision.
It's paralysis by analysis. If you demand perfect verified warrants for every single action, you will fail in the real world, because the real world demands velocity.
But the CLEAR manual has a direct remedy for this. It introduces this concept of reasonable sufficiency.
Right. CLEAR does not require formal academic proof for ordinary life. You are supposed to use the latest reasoning process that is adequate to the stakes. We touched on this with the triage rule early on, but the practice lab section in the manual gives a fantastic, visceral example of what this looks like when the stakes are incredibly high.
The toxic plant scenario.
They call it the toxic plant scenario, yes.
Set the scene for us on this one.
Imagine you are the director of a large industrial chemical plant. Suddenly, three independently calibrated sensors on the factory floor indicate a toxic gas release. The klaxons are blaring.
Okay, high stakes.
Now, this warning is somewhat consistent with a recent software fault you've been having in the sensor network. A very rigorous analytical stakeholder in the control room says, wait, every sensor has a known error rate. We know we've had software glitches.
We're trying to use the loop.
Right. They say we do not have absolute epistemic proof of a physical leak. We cannot blindly promote this alarm to a factory shutdown. I demand we send a hazmat team in to do a manual chemical swab test before we initiate a mass evacuation.
So this stakeholder is trying to use critical thinking. They were demanding more proof, avoiding a silent promotion, trying to be rigorous.
But according to the rules of CLEAR in this specific asymmetric context, demanding that certainty is a massive reasoning failure. It is what they call underpromotion.
Under promotion. The flip side of the coin.
Exactly. The manual dictates that you must evacuate the plant immediately. Why? Because the action threshold has been overwhelmingly met. The cost of delay is potentially lethal to hundreds of workers.
Right.
And the action evacuation is highly reversible. If it turns out to be a software glitch, you lose a few hours of production, you reset the system, and people go back to work. Demanding perfect epistemic certainty when the asymmetric costs heavily favor immediate reversible action is just as dangerous as jumping to conclusions.
Yep. So what does this all mean for you, the listener? I think it points to a massive relief. The goal of upgrading your mental operating system isn't to achieve some state of perfect logic where you are never, ever wrong. That's impossible in a chaotic world.
The primary goal is to be wrong less often on the structural things that truly matter. But the secondary and perhaps more vital goal is to minimize what the manual calls correction latency.
Correction latency, that's a brilliant term. It's the amount of time it takes you to physically change your mind and alter your behavior once decisive contrary evidence actually arrives.
A robust conclusion should be stable enough to act on confidently today, but conditional enough to reopen tomorrow. You want to shrink the time between the facts on the ground have materially changed and I have changed my operating procedure.
Wow, yeah.
A long correction latency is usually a red flag that ego, tribal identity, or sunk costs have completely hijacked your reasoning process.
So how do we actually shrink that latency? How do I make sure I don't get trapped by my own pride once I commit to a path?
For significant choices, the manual suggests generating what it calls a decision warrant receipt.
I love this. A literal receipt for your brain. I want to challenge everyone listening to actually do this today for a choice they're currently wrestling with. How does it work?
When you make a highly consequential decision, taking a new job, pivoting your company's strategy, moving across the country, you write down exactly what you chose to do. You write down the specific evidence you relied on, the alternatives you considered and rejected, and this is the linchpin. You establish a pre-committed review trigger.
The pre-committed review trigger. This is the magic trick.
It is. You write down in advance the exact future event or the specific metric that would force you to admit you were wrong and reopen the case.
Like, I am launching this product strategy today because I believe the market wants X. However, I pre-commit that if user retention drops below 40% by Q3, I will formally reverse this policy, no questions asked.
Precisely. If you do not pre-commit to the trigger, your brain will constantly move the goalposts to protect your ego when the metrics start to slide. You'll say, well, the market is just slow, we need more time.
Right. You make excuses.
By writing the receipt, you are giving your future self absolute permission to change course without feeling like a failure. You are structurally building revisability into your life.
That is such a profound, tangible way to close the loop on this entire framework. We started this deep dive talking about how to survive the sheer chaos and cognitive overload of modern information streams. And by working through this lean field manual, we've actually built something incredibly robust.
We have. We've learned the mechanics of how to spot the silent, unsupported promotions, those corporate interns trying to sign million-dollar cognitive checks. We've learned to use triage, scaling our attention to the actual risk of the claim, rather than trying to investigate every tweet.
We know how to strip away the emotional slogans and locate the true upstream source, demanding effective independence, rather than just being hypnotized by the sheer volume of voices shouting the exact same wire report.
We've learned to evaluate evidence relative to its specific purpose, and we've practiced attacking our own architectural biases with incredibly uncomfortable tools like the identity swap.
And finally, we've learned to separate our belief in what is true from the threshold required to take action. We know how to avoid paralyzing ourselves by demanding perfect proof when the stakes dictate we need to move. Armed with this framework, you can navigate the headlines, the convoluted workplace memos, and the incredibly slick AI outputs without feeling like you are drowning. You are no longer just a passive consumer of the feed. You are an operator.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the entire Clear manual focuses exclusively on how you, the individual, can defend your own mind. It's a personal defensive tool. But imagine if we started scaling this architecture up. Imagine if we started demanding decision warrant receipts from our politicians, our institutional leaders, our media figures.
That would be revolutionary.
Think about it. If the people in power were required to pre-commit publicly and on the record to the exact measurable evidence that would definitively prove their new policies wrong, how dramatically would the landscape of human leadership change overnight?
That is a world I would very much like to live in. And it is something for you to mull over the next time you see a leader in business, politics, or media promising you the moon without offering a single review trigger. We will leave you with that thought. Keep your systems updated, and we'll catch you on the next deep dive.